It's really a pleasure to be here, and I just want to make sure that I don't have this double echo. Good. I think it was a perfect cue that Dave had about videos and how to tell stories, because visualization is really about insights and storytelling. In fact, my last tweet, if you were not following, was about how do you make sense of visualizations without a narrative or storytelling. Certainly good visualizations speak for themselves. I've been working with MediaX and Martha and her group on how do we actually use data-driven approaches to visualizing complex business ecosystems. I'm a faculty member in the School of Interactive Computing, but I'm actually by training an engineer, so I have a deep appreciation for complex systems. This work is actually a collaboration with Dr. Peter Evans of the Center for Global Enterprise. Center for Global Enterprise was founded by the former chairman and CEO Sam Palmisano of IBM in 2013, and the goal of this think tank is to understand how enterprises go global. One of the 4 threads that was supported by the center is on computational enterprise analytics. One of the things that Michael mentioned is, wouldn't it be great to have computational organizational science? Well, in fact, we are pursuing this in some ways. And the lab that I run at Georgia Tech is called the Computational Enterprise Science Lab. And the idea behind this research thread is that how do we actually inform decision makers how to change their strategy, how they transform their enterprise using more of a data-driven approach? How do we provide tools to executives that may have very limited time to digest lots of information and then drive their strategy forward? Peter is heavily involved in the platform economy work. In fact, he is curating an extensive database on platforms and digital platforms through the center, along with a global team of researchers. And I'm sure that he'll be happy to share more information. Since you are actually here in the Bay Area, you probably know what this looks like. But if I present this around the world, innovation actually happened really by an individual person, probably in a garage. But what's actually happening in reality is innovation is happening around the world with a constellation of companies, individuals, enterprises together. The problem of this globalization is that decision makers have a very difficult time to understand the complex landscape. In fact, they're very good at understanding what's happening in their immediate vicinity, in their boundary. They might understand their partners and members, but beyond that, it's actually rather difficult. You ask why that's important, because a global view is incredibly critical. You could have disruptive forces, competitive changes, new innovation happening that you might not necessarily know, and that could happen at a global scale. So the notion of where your perspective is, that you want to see the trees and what now lots of people are talking about, this ecosystem of different entities, is very important. So in my research, this is exactly what I pursue. We've developed tools to see the very small, the very far, but what we really haven't done is to see the complex. How to make sense of complex socio-technical economic situations using a data-driven approach. So this focus for this particular talk is going to be on visualizing the digital platform ecosystem. So we talked about lots of different platforms. And what we're looking at is how do companies create platforms, consume them, integrate them, recombine them, and then can we make sense of what this ecosystem is evolving in. And we're using various techniques to do that. So my background is in engineering, but I do a lot of data mining and visualization work. And the field that's emerging is called visual analytics, that's really trying to shed light on this. So why do we study platforms? Now, Martha has convened this group on platforms for collaboration and productivity. It turns out that platforms can be found in lots of different areas. Peter has actually defined 4 different types of platforms: transaction, investment, digital, and innovation platforms. But we can see, actually, if you look at the comparison of companies, so this is drawn from Mary Meeker's report this year, is when we looked at 1995, we have a lot of companies, internet companies that existed. But now we're seeing an enormous growth in platform companies in 2015. In fact, the valuation and the capitalization is enormous of these companies. Platform companies play an incredibly critical role. In fact, most unicorns, we talked about unicorns here earlier, are platform companies. So if we looked at this time about 115 unicorns that were above 1 billion, almost 80 out of the 115 were platform companies. So Peter has pulled this data from various data sources together to map how they looked at different industries, and platforms are all over the place. In fact, it's a global phenomenon. So digital platforms transform entire industries. I run the Journal of Enterprise Transformation, and we're fundamentally interested how digital platforms and technologies drive new business models, maybe new financial models, and how actually organizations are adapting their strategies to this new reality. An interesting thing is that you have to think about this globally when you're thinking about platforms. So I've been involved in visualization and mapping of industries for a very long time. In fact, it started with an early paper in 2008, which looked at how to measure the complexity of a business ecosystem. And the idea is that industries operate at different velocities, and can we now understand the structure of these ecosystems and why they're behaving a certain way. That led to work in understanding converging ecosystems and looking at how different segments cooperate with each other. And over time, I've developed tools to interactively explore that. I ran special issues on this, and we're working on really in-depth analysis of ecosystems and platforms. In fact, you cannot separate those two ideas in many ways. Let me give you an illustration. So in 2009, I mapped an ecosystem, the mobile ecosystem. This only depicts the top 500 companies. And at that time, companies like Google and Apple were really not in the mobile ecosystem. They're color-coded as follows. The blue dots that you're seeing, I hope you can see this. Oh, ran this perfectly. The blue dots are entering or emerging companies into the mobile ecosystem, and the yellow ones were those that actually are incumbents. And what you're seeing is the separation of incumbents and emergent companies. And the center on here illustrates that some companies are actually moving towards the center. So the usual suspects are certainly there, like Cisco, Qualcomm, Microsoft, and IBM. I know many of them are in the audience. But companies that were sort of emerging are starting to come in, like the Googles and Apples at that time. What's interesting in here, so the edges actually indicate relationship between the companies. That could be R&D, supply chain, marketing, licensing, tech transfer. And in this case, it's a holistic view of this. But when we abstract that up to the broader market segment view on how companies interact, one very interesting thing emerged from this data. So if you look at the yellow dots again and the blue dots, there's one particular segment that connected the emerging and the incumbents. And those were the platform providers. In this case, the platform providers were primarily operating system companies that provided sort of the interface between the different segments. In graph theoretic terms, if you remove that node from the ecosystem, it would actually disintegrate the network. It would actually create perhaps a network that's not as strongly interconnected. So even in 2009, when the platform battle was heating up between Apple and Google and so on, we were able to derive from data already the importance of platform providers. And we also confirmed things like that companies that were incumbents, like the network infrastructure providers, device manufacturers, and so on, had very close ties. So we took this idea a little further, and what we found is that 90% of the competitive intelligence that you need to do for your companies is actually in the public space. Certainly proprietary information is important, but you have a vast amount of public information available that ranges anywhere from patent data to press releases to analyst reports. Of course, social media is now emerging as a big source of data, but then also socially curated databases like Crunchbase. If you're a startup, you're generally listed in a Crunchbase ecosystem. Now there's lots of other data sources that you can leverage. And even with this 90% of the data, we can provide relatively good insight into how ecosystems operate. So I had an opportunity to speak with the New York Times about this, and I really liked what Steve Lohr of the New York Times pulled out of the talk. And the idea is to make big data think bigger. I actually like the term wide data more than big data, because what we need is not more of the same. We need more of lots of different things put together. Similarly to what we heard in healthcare, that we need lots of different data sources formed together. But we're seeking a scientific, data-driven understanding of organizations that can help executive decision makers gain insight into their complex landscape. But there's an art and science to visualization. So when I talk to my PhD students, we talk about techniques and principles. But there's also a subjective manner. We want to create somewhat nice looking pictures as well. But insight is really critical. So if you have pretty visualizations but they don't provide any insight, you really have failed probably the objective that you wanted to pursue. So there is an art and science, and so hopefully you'll see part science and some art in what I'm going to present now on the digital platform ecosystem. Okay, so the data that we use to map the digital platform ecosystem are actually multiple data sources. There's one particular source out there, it's called the programmable web. It's basically a collection of all platforms and APIs that exist out there. And it's a wonderful repository of companies that provide open access to their data or to certain services or products, digital products and services. And so there's roughly 11,000 in there. A mashup is when you combine APIs together. And they range from all kinds of categories. They range from search and e-commerce to transportation, health, and e-commerce and enterprise. And so we meshed that data together with Crunchbase data as well, which had company and investment information as well. And we mapped that particular ecosystem. And so these are some of the results that we had. So the digital platform ecosystem looks like this. And this is the universe of all APIs. The node indicates an API. Two APIs are connected together if they share a mashup. The thickness indicates how many times it was used and how many times it was combined. I'm showing you in graph theoretic terms the main component only, which is only 6% of all APIs. And the reason I did this is it becomes very unmanageable to show on a PowerPoint, and without interaction, it really fails. The way it's color-coded is we're looking at subcommunities in this graph. What hangs together? Okay, and they call it community detection or modularity detection within graphs. What's very interesting, this is all driven by data, okay? And so what we're seeing is that there's particular modules coming out of this graph. If you want to guess what they are, I'm going to find out soon. If you look at a close-up, there are some very usual suspects in here. So you see Google Maps and Foursquare and Flickr, some of the e-commerce things, PayPal's in here, lots of Amazon things as well. But I wanted to show you as an overview back here. So if you look at that ecosystem again of how APIs hang together, well, it turns out that they cluster quite nicely. Now, I did a very crude topic modeling on this because it turns out that they're not cleanly just e-commerce or just developer productivity within that cluster. But largely, that's what they are. So in developer and productivity, GitHub is an open API that's made available. We're looking at financial payments. Coinbase is one of the companies. At the center, really, we see mobile, social, search, maybe even reference, sometimes even mapping. But it's interesting to see how the different clusters really bring together. Analytics and infrastructure, which is really remarkable, is at the heart of all of this, okay, is at the core. The position in here means that it is very central to all the ecosystem players combined, okay? So that means that information flows through them, or they're as part of the central node in the ecosystem. If you just look at the case of mapping, so what I did is I blended out all the other companies, but I looked at just the mapping APIs that exist out there. So we see Google Maps is certainly the most prominent one. I think this might work actually here, is Google Maps. But then we also see companies like Microsoft Bing Maps, Esri ArcGIS, which is also used in a lot of transportation-related GIS types of applications. And certainly more the other types of mapping tools like MapQuest and Google Latitude. What's interesting in the mapping case is that mapping is playing an incredibly important role for lots of products and services that are out there, digital products and services. Whoops. One really interesting analysis that we did in here is a comparison between two companies that might be going different directions perhaps, but are still giants in the retail space. So Amazon and Walmart are two wonderful case examples. It turns out that Amazon has an API or digital platform strategy. Jeff Bezos actually clearly stated that we want to make as much of it open as possible. In fact, a lot of the infrastructure services that they provide are digital platforms. When you compare that to Walmart, Walmart only has one API. In fact, based on that API, not a lot of other value is being generated. And so we did a contrast between Walmart and Amazon in this particular case study to clearly show that Amazon is positioning itself much more broadly into this digital platform ecosystem. Now, I did want to say the similar analogy that I did with the mobile ecosystem to bring it up at the higher level at categories. Well, these are the categories now. And what we found, we applied the same principles of there's APIs that belong to categories. Categories are connected if they are, there's new APIs, digital platforms generated. And so what we're seeing are really four major clusters emerging as well. And I broadly labeled them as social consumer, application domains, infrastructure, enterprise, payment and finance. And within all of that, there are lots of APIs. But what's very interesting, if you look at the enterprise, payment and finance cluster, software as a service is deeply embedded in that particular piece. It's showing you that actually the pieces that were maybe infrastructure are pulled into different parts of the API ecosystem. What we're also seeing is analytics and big data are at the core of the digital ecosystem and sort of all embedded versus applications, consumer, and enterprise. And IoT, which is really an emerging category of APIs, which actually all of it might be considered IoT in some ways, but IoT that are just specifically labeled as an IoT API is somewhat centrally located to all of it, which actually poses some interesting questions and hypotheses. Is that how will all of this play out when all these things get interconnected and networked? Now, one interesting thing in here that I found is there's a category called England. I really thought it was bad data. And so I went back to the data source, and it turns out England has a lot of APIs. The country or the government, so we talked about Estonia, is actually branding its APIs to make them available as a service to other players in the API ecosystem. So this is not a bad data point, but visualization allowed me to focus down on why is England in there. But it's certainly very interesting that it makes it available to all the other services that are out there. So that led me to another piece, and I'm going to conclude with two slides that are really research in progress. I was interested in who is funding the API or digital platform ecosystem. And the reason behind that is we wanted to understand there's certain investors that actually have a digital platform strategy in their investment portfolio, which might actually indicate who is actually pursuing investments for maybe IoT and other future emerging economies. And you see some usual suspects, and I'm only going to leave you with this slide right now. The size indicates how many investment that company has made in a API or platform company. So what you're seeing is also some clusters emerge. I left it convoluted on purpose because I don't have specific insights in there. But companies like Sequoia are certainly playing an incredibly important role, as are SV Angel. Not surprisingly, many of the companies are based in Silicon Valley. Most of the VCs and angel investors are actually here. But we're looking at this from a global perspective to understand how the ecosystem is evolving. So our next steps within this data-driven approach to visualizing digital platform ecosystem. So this is just one subset of a very large data set that we have. But we want to understand how our organization is actually using digital platforms. There is actually data out there that tells us what APIs companies are using on their website already. So we can tie in all the Fortune 500s as well as the Crunchbase 50,000 with the APIs that they're consuming. We have a data set that looks at collaboration between companies and the alliances, what I showed you earlier. So we're trying to map that back to the particular digital platform data set. The role of digital platforms in the IoT ecosystem is really pervasive. So we're getting a lot of questions about how are the standard movements happening. What standard might work, win out, and how can we provide insights into that? We're doing some domain-specific analysis in healthcare and manufacturing and energy as well. And lastly, I've shown you static representations. And so I'm actually at fault here. Visualization is representation plus interaction. And so we're developing interactive tools for you to play with this data. Data that you may want to put in, that you have proprietary or you want to openly explore as well. So I'd like to thank a lot of the supporters that have supported this research and a series of research studies. And with that, I'll leave some time for questions.